From advertising to software as a service to data.
Across all of our programs and clients, we've seen a 55 to 65% open rate.
Getting brands authentically integrated into content performs better than TV advertising.
Typical lifespan of an article is about 24 to 36 hours.
If we're reaching out to the right person with the right message and a clear call to action, then it's just a matter of timing.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast, and I Hear Everything production. In this podcast, you'll hear the stories of world-class marketers that use technology to drive business results and achieve career success. We'll unearth the real-world experiences of some of the brightest minds in the marketing and technology space so you can learn the tools, tips, and tricks they've learned along the way. Now here's the host of the MarTech Podcast, Benjamin Shapiro.
Welcome to the MarTech Podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Shapiro, and today we're going to discuss how podcast booking campaigns create value for listeners and for brands. Joining us is Max Novak, who is the founder of Novacast, which is a podcast booking agency for clean tech and SaaS businesses. Novacast carefully crafts podcast booking campaigns to increase strategic visibility, create awesome content, and of course, grow brands' revenues. Yesterday, Max and I discussed whether podcast booking campaigns are effective, and today we're going to continue the conversation talking about tech-driven ways to get on podcasts. All right, here's the second part of my conversation with Max Novak, the founder of Novacast. Max, welcome back to the MarTech Podcast.
Hi, happy to be here once again.
Excited to have you back on the show and excited to talk about a marketing channel that we both know intimately and love, podcasting. Yesterday, we talked about whether podcast guesting campaigns are effective. And to me, the answer is, well, it depends what you're trying to get out of it. If you are going to put in the work to go hit the circuit in targeted podcasts, you can really make a personal impact on the listeners that can humanize your brand. If you're just going to go speak on one podcast that doesn't have reach, well, you can't expect great results. So it's a little bit of a volume play and a little bit of a question of who's delivering the message and what are they going to say. Let's talk a little bit about the process for getting on podcasts. Talk me through some of the technology brands can use to understand what are the good podcasts, how do they do their outreach, and how do they secure guest speaking spots?
I think the first thing that's important is not trying to overcomplicate it because you can get a lot of applications out there. I tried it all and now I kind of tend to keep it simple. So the first and foremost is really trying to get your messaging right. What do you want to talk about? 2-3 topics will suffice, right call to action. But really in terms of the tech-driven ways is the way you want to research your podcast. You can do it quite simple. Just go to Google, look it up, go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, you'll find it there. And once you find those, let's say 10, 15 first initial podcasts you want to be on, you can go to chartable.com or listennotes.com, and there you'll get already the first bits of data you want to know. So that's like how many ratings are there, what are the reviews, what do people say about this podcast, where does it lie within the top 10, 0.5% of the industry, what is it known for, what's the type of audience, what's the size of them. Then you can go look it up for yourself just on social media. There's LinkedIn, Instagram are the most used, then the websites, of course. And you can keep it simple. You can keep it there. The way you want to organize yourself, that's quite important. If you get sending out emails, you can get a lot of answers or none, but you want to keep that in a certain spot, So there's CRM tools like HubSpot, which are great. But if you're just starting out, I think a great way to begin is just Excel sheets. Go on Google Drive, open up an Excel, put in the name, the data, the email. That's important. And that's it. What's your follow-ups? I'd say after 10, 14 days is a good time to do a very short follow-up. Now, to find the emails, that can be a bit tricky. So you can go to outreach.io where you'll find some emails. But first, try to just go on the website of the podcast itself. You might find an email there for guest propositions, or you'll find a questionnaire. So if you find a questionnaire, please don't send these for podcast hosts an email because they get plenty and you won't probably get an answer. Now, if you're out of options, what we also tend to do is subscribe to the newsletter and we can answer there. But you don't want to be spammy because you won't get any email. Try to personalize every single email you send out try to do some research before sending them. And yeah, that's it.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Your process for doing your research, you're going to Apple and Google and trying to come up with a list. You can get some data on the podcast through Listen Notes and Chartable. Listen Notes will give you things like a speaker score or basically a ranking of the podcast, which maybe that's a proxy for how big the podcast is, but honestly, podcast sizes vary based on their prominence. You're also going to Chartable and seeing where they rank in the App Store. How much do you care about what someone's scoring is on Listen Notes or what their ranking is? Does that actually tell you how big, good, or credible the show is?
Well, some people can already buy reviews, they can buy kind of stuff. I don't know everything about that, but I know some people can get in a better position by buying something. I don't know exactly how that works, but it's not the most important. To me, the first thing I really look at is this filled with the right audience? Is this the right topic, the subject matter? Is this a thoughtful connection? That's always the first question I ask myself. Would this make sense? And you want to ask yourself that first, because if it doesn't make sense, it won't make sense to the podcast host and you won't get any answer. So you really want to be able to give value to the audience. And the only way you can do that is by doing your research and finding the right podcasts out there for your particular expertise and subject you want to talk about.
So it's difficult to truly understand a podcast's credibility or its size, downloads, who's in the audience. It's one of those things that you kind of have to figure out by having a relationship with the podcaster. When you're doing your outreach to a podcaster, you mentioned things like, well, reply to their newsletter, figure out a way to go through a form if they have one. Talk to me a little bit about what you're putting in the messaging. Are there specific points of data, or have you found best practices for reaching out to podcasters that get to catch their attention and help you book your podcast appearance?
That's a tough one because it really depends. Podcast hosts can have their whole year planned ahead. They can have already the whole content filled in and they know exactly what they're looking for. That can be a bit tricky. Now, I think try to stand out and then you get in the details. Try to find a subject title that stands out, something that's slightly funny, that is interesting to talk about, and that you don't reveal everything. You don't want to raise like, oh, what is this about? And then try to keep your email short. The way you reach out, you want to have a first introduction that is highly personalized. Why did you find the podcast? How did you get there? Why do you think it's interesting? What do you love about the podcast yourself? Have you listened to any episodes? Make a reference there. And then you want to have 2 to 4 topic points you want to talk about, right? Don't try to overdo that because you can't be an expert in everything. And provide your links. Make it just easy for a podcast host. Imagine they get 100 emails in a day. They don't want to spend time researching it themselves. So you want to keep that fast, easy to go. You can have a bio one sheet in it if you want, just a link there with all the other links in that profile. That's also something you can do. You can make a video even where you speak and introduce yourself. Try to stand out in a nice way.
We get a lot of podcast applications, and maybe our system for evaluating them is a little more advanced than the average podcasters. We make everybody go through a form to submit a guest application where we make them say, what are the topics you want to talk about? Who are you? What are your social accounts? And then we're doing things like enriching their social accounts so we understand how big of a following they have. We're looking at their domain rank. We're looking at their title, what type of company, and then obviously what they want to talk about. And we put that all into an algorithm to basically try to take a data-driven approach. Are there specific things that you could point out to a podcaster that would be useful to help them understand what value you can bring to them by being your guest beyond just, I could talk about a given topic?
What I try to put in is I'll analyze, let's say, an outbound clients and everything they've put out. So that goes from blog articles to social media posts. And then I'll try to include that in the pitch also, like, hey, they can talk about that. It's kind of like social proof. Allow me to give in this link or this social media post they've recently had some success with and lots of views. That's their previous work. It just works as a testimonial. It's social proof, it's like, hey, they've done this, it's not just talk, this is it, right? And that can help a lot. I'll try to include a link to a blog article or something like it to really support what I'm saying in the pitch itself.
One of the things I think that people that are reaching out to be guests on podcasts need to think about is who they're reaching out to. I feel like a lot of the times brands are reaching out, to me and to us, to our network of podcasts here that I Hear Everything, thinking about what they can get out of it. Hey, I really want to be on your podcast because this company is doing something innovative and we want to share it with the world. And I feel like a lot of the times brands are missing the boat in terms of understanding that you're starting a business relationship with essentially a media company. And sure, they're personal, they're influencers, they're people that are putting their time into creating content. Often it seems a little one-sided in, well, I want access to your audience, here's what I can tell them, as opposed to the message being, I'm a fan of your podcast, here's what I can deliver to help you. Here's the topic I want to cover and how I would promote it. How do you advise brands to talk about what promotion they would do and how they can help support the podcasters in exchange for being on their show?
That's a very good point. It's all about really crafting win-win situations. So I've had lots of conversations with podcast hosts, and not to pitch clients, just to be like, hey, this might have been not the best proposition for you, but hey, is there something specific you're looking for? What would be the perfect guest for you at this stage? And that's how we've built lots of relationships, and then we've been able to connect the dots later on. So as you said, it's super important to craft good relationships with podcast hosts because they are busy people. Sometimes they can get overloaded with emails. So you want to be very careful by not hurting their feelings, let's say. Now, what you want to put forward is really like, hey, I'm not just trying to sell my stuff here. I love what I do, and I'd love to talk about it on your podcast because I know your people might be very interested in this. And if it's not the perfect fit, that's fine. I just thought this would have been a very good proposition. I'd love to know your thoughts on this. So it's more about like not telling, but asking like, hey, would this be a right fit for you at this particular time? We don't like to push things forward. Just ask a little bit around. Maybe even ask a previous guest like, hey, I saw you went on this podcast. I'd absolutely love to get on there. Could you maybe tell me how would be a good way, or could you get me the right email? You can do that also.
I think of it a little bit like finding a job. You can always submit an application. You can always go through the normal portal, but in reality, the best way to find a great job is through networking. And often when you're thinking about becoming a guest in a podcast, the direct outreach is something that can be effective if you show how you're going to provide value. But often the right way to get on a podcast is building a relationship with the podcaster or the people that they know. Think about networking. Think about using your professional relationships. You can find them on LinkedIn to build a relationship, to get a referral, all the other things that help build business relationships. It's no different than what's happening in podcasting. And that wraps up this episode of the Martech Podcast. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Max Novak, the founder of Novacast. If you'd like to get in touch with Max, you can find a link to his LinkedIn profile in our show notes, or you could visit his company's website, which is novacast.be. That's novacast.be. Just one more link in our show notes I'd like to tell you about. If you didn't have a chance to take notes while you were listening to this podcast, head over to martechpod.com, where we have summaries of all of our episodes and contact information for our guests. You can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter, and you can even send us your topic suggestions or your marketing questions, which we'll answer live on our show. Of course, you can always reach out on social media. Our handle is martechpod, MARTECHPOD, on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Or you can contact me directly. My handle is Ben J. Shap, BenJShap. And if you haven't subscribed yet and you want a daily stream of marketing and technology knowledge in your podcast feed, we're going to publish an episode every day this year. So hit the subscribe button in your podcast app and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. All right, that's it for today. But until next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.